Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy. Today is Tuesday, March 11th, 2025. And our 5-minute grace period has just elapsed, and we will now commence with the formal lecture part of this week's lecture/office hour. As always, after the lecture, formal lecture part, I would stop the recording, and then we will go into our Q&A as necessary. And from there, we will transition, as always, to our office hour. So 3 classes ago, we began a 3-part study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. Again, the 3 major perspectives of global trade include the liberal perspective, the realistic perspective, and historical materialism. Our discussion last week centered on realistic perspective. As we discussed in previous weeks, the common feature of the group of critical perspectives is that they are all critical of the traditional mainstream liberal and realistic perspectives. While we will touch on several critical perspectives, we will devote more attention to historical materialism or Marxist theory than to other critical perspectives, because it encompasses the largest group of critical theories, including Marxism, dependency theory, world system theory, and Gramscian analysis. Although all these approaches have some root in Marxism, they often diverge substantially from classical Marxist thought. Historical materialism is historical because it examines structural changes in terms of class and sometimes North-South struggles over time, and its role in materialist, because it examines the role of material, especially economic factors, in shaping society. So again, the North-South divide is short form for the global North and the global South, with the global North generally considered more industrialized and wealthy, and the global South consisting mostly of developing countries. So the North-South struggle over time, and it is materialistic in the sense that it examines the role of material, especially economic. So what are the learning outcomes for the week? Upon the completion of this module, you will be able to explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade relations. And one of the ways to think about this, right? One of the ways to think about the Marxian school of thought with respect to global trade relations is that the relations perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profit through exploration of surplus labor. So again, Marxian school of thought on global trade relations perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profit through exploitation of surplus labor. It considers global trade relations as an inherently unequal exchange. The Marxian narrative fits into the phenomena of colonial trade between developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as exchange of production between underdeveloped societies. More broadly, the Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not the clash of interest and power, but rather a reflection of the global mode of production and the ensuring relation of production among nations. So the second learning objective for the week is to describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of neo-Gramscian theory. For you to also be able to provide examples of dependency theory of global trade. The neo-Gramscian approach does not consider the realist schools of thought and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive, but rather considers the very theoretical foundation of the two schools of thought as mutually reinforcing with interlocking relationship between agency and structure. In neo-Gramscian approach, a class or nation state cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest, and neither can it dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. Examples of the dependency theory of global trade relations include, some would argue, China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the BRI, as the Belt and Road Initiative is called, has been accused by many institutions in the West as creating a debt trap for, and therefore dependency. Of course, some in this class have argued that IMF is also a Western institution that creates dependency. But I think the responsible thing for me to do would also be to point out that China takes a different view. The BRI is not a debt trap. The BRI provides infrastructure for and to facilitate global trade and to connect hitherto fringe countries who are considered on the fringe or on the periphery, and provide avenues for them to engage in global trade. There is some merit to that argument. There is also some merit to the argument that some of the projects, at least, that has been funded by BRI were not bankable projects. That better due diligence would have found them not to be better bankable projects and therefore not worthy of finance. That financing them will eventually lead to a debt trap. And in the case of the port in Sri Lanka, I think it's Lombambato, and I don't want to really murder the name of the port. China had to take over the port because Sri Lanka simply could not afford to repay the debt. And the trade volume that was anticipated has not panned out. Another classic example on the African continent would be the rail line in in Kenya, from I think Mombasa to Nairobi, if I remember correctly. But the facts of that rail line is that the trade volume has not been able to sustain that rail operation, and thus far it has operated at a deficit, even as Kenya is saddled with repayment. It would also be fair to note that some of the challenges why these projects fail clearly would also have to do with domestic internal politics in the recipient country. And these are the kind of challenges that China cannot be reasonably be expected to exert any level of significant influence. And with respect to IMF, it is true that when countries approach IMF, IMF does not approach countries. And it's also true that IMF is a lender of last resort. So by the time countries approach IMF, they have already run into difficulty with all other lenders. So it is not clear how IMF is the driver of the debt challenges of these countries because they're already in debt and run out of options, which is why they approach IMF. Now, it is fair to say that IMF can do a better job at tailoring its credit facilities to the peculiarities of each country, but that becomes really burdensome on IMF as well. Again, deeper conversations for another class. So another example of dependency theory is the active extraction of resources from less industrialized, poor, or periphery countries for the core benefit of the highly industrialized, wealthy countries. In this way, the world is polarized into two: the patron, highly industrialized, wealthy, poor nations, and the dependent, less industrialized, poor periphery nations. The theory would argue that periphery countries are poor because they are forcefully integrated into the international division of labor, where they principally function as suppliers of raw materials or repositories of cheap labor. This resource diversion is typically maintained through active collaboration of local elites of poor countries and dominant states who share common interests. Again, it is consumers with purchasing power are going to consume. And this reminds me of a big part of my grad school thesis, which is on the bigger driver of economic growth, whether it is predestination or institutions, right? The argument is that regions that are closer to the sea are more likely to prosper than regions that are landlocked, and that's predestination. Institution would argue that you need to have effective institutions and have efficient bureaucracies for a country to be able to prosper. So the reality of it is that many of the resources that the global north has been accused of exploiting from global south, the innovation that creates the demand for those resources reside in the global north. The biggest consumers of those resources reside in the global north. Now, I realize that what we call in Economics 101 or basic economics, effective demand. So it's not just a desire to want a good or service, it's the capacity to pay for that good and service that makes your demand effective. Most effective demand, at least effective demand for these resources in the global north outstrips the effective demand in the global south. Now, 25 years ago, nobody was saying much about rare earth minerals as an example. But today, there's lots of conversation and competition for rare earth minerals, be it the current deal that it appears the United States might end up closing with Ukraine today in Saudi Arabia. Or, as we've also heard in the news, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a big country in Central Africa, or somewhere between Central and East Africa, their effort to sign a resource agreement with the United States in exchange for security guarantees. The reason rare earths are in the news today is because of innovation that is created in the global north and major demand for these resources as input products for the innovation that is driven in the global north. So sometimes, this is a long way of saying that sometimes the argument And this is not to say that the argument is entirely without merit. That's not the case. It does have some merit. But it's often had, this conversation is often had without regard to the lack of innovation from the global south. The very innovation that creates the value for these commodities. Because these commodities have no intrinsic value except for the innovation that now needs them as a feed product. So that is also a part of the conversation that is often lost. As I often repeat in this class, real scholars take a dialectic view of issues. So the scholars look at an issue from all sides, and that's how you really begin to get a balanced view. So this is not, again, my comment is not to dispute or disregard or discount the argument that countries in the global south can sometimes be seen as a principal supplier of raw materials and a repository of cheap labor. But there are other dynamics that are driven by internal structures in the global south countries that reinforce, if not create, this imbalance or this asymmetric relationship. The third learning outcome is to argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which is really as I have explained. The other thing also is that it's helpful to acknowledge that multinational companies sometimes have outsized influence, especially when they deal with poorer countries. In most cases, the multinational company would be the biggest employer in that country. And if we were simply to pull away from that country and go somewhere else, then the mass unemployment and economic chaos and loss of revenue for the state will be devastating. So you could look at Bangladesh as an example. Bangladesh has a huge business that dismantles ships. It is also thought that that ship dismantling industry in Indonesia causes a lot of environmental and public health challenges, However, it also creates a lot of employment. And if a real effort were to be made, a transformational effort to clean up that industry, that would also raise the cost and therefore competitiveness of Bangladesh to compete in the ship dismantling business. And that business will likely go somewhere else. So that is the catch-22 that leadership in many developing countries feel. And sometimes they're just collaborators too, because they probably own a stake. Most countries, there are joint ventures, public-private partnerships that are built into extraction industries, and the political and business elite in developing countries all have a stake. So in this case, they are partners and collaborators with the multinational companies. And that is the reality. And that is what the argument here that that historical materialism would argue and Marxism would argue that there is a structural imbalance in these relationships, and that the structure is such that there will be a client-patron relationship between the rich and industrialized North and the underdeveloped and underdeveloped and or developing countries in the global South. So that is the nature of the challenge. So with that, that is the core of the week 7 module 7. So you should now be able to explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade relations. You ought to be able to describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of neo-Gramscian theory. You should be able to provide examples of dependency theory of global trade relations, and you should be able to argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So with our studies over the past 3 weeks, and by the end of this office hour, you should be able to do the following. 1, identify at least 3 critical ideological perspectives of global trade and political economy. 2, explain the philosophical differences between the critical perspective and the liberal perspective and the realistic perspective. Describe the differences between the various critical perspectives. And for next week, our focus will be on international monetary relations. And this is where things really begin to get interesting, even more interesting. And we get to hopefully delve a little bit deeper into the IMF and how the IMF functions. IMF, of course, being the International Monetary Fund, and how and why some of the criticism leveled against IMF is the way they are. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording now. And with that, we'll take questions.